Happy Monday. I hope you had really great weekends. So happy to see you back in the NSE today. Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 830th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege today of being your MC for a conversation with Ishmael Randall Weeks and Tom McGlynn. We're also thrilled to welcome poet Will Stanier here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Ishmael Randall Weeks is a graduate of Bard College and Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. His work has been exhibited in various galleries and museums in Peru and internationally and in numerous biennials. He has been the recipient of many residency grants and awards from institutes including the Rockefeller Foundation and the Foundation of Contemporary Arts, among others. Artist, writer, and independent curator Tom McGlynn is based in the New York area. His work is represented in permanent collections of the Whitney Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, and Cooper Hewitt at the Smithsonian. He is a part-time professor at Parsons, and his exhibition, What Gives, is on now at Rick Wester Fine Art in New York through June 30th. So definitely go check that out if you're in the area. And we are lucky to have him as an editor-at-large here at the Brooklyn Rail. It's such an honor to have you both here on the NSE today, and I'm super excited to pass it over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. Yeah, it's a real pleasure, first of all, to get to know Ishmael's work in depth. It's a great opportunity to get. It's such a comprehensive body of work. It's kind of a remarkable body of work. And if I may, I'd like to inaugurate our conversation with a fragment of a poem from Lord Byron, which I thought applies pretty well to Ishmael's practice. So this is from Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, and the quote is, "I am not in myself, but I become portion of that around me." And I think I came upon this quote serendipitously this morning, believe it or not, in doing some other research, but I did think it applied to Ishmael's practice because.
Could you read that again, Tom?
Oh, sure, yeah. It's from Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. "I am not in myself, but I become portion of that around me." So the syntax is a little strange, but it made me think of your practice, Ishmael, in terms of how you incorporate what's around you and how your subjectivity as an artist it's kind of kaleidoscopically reflected in the work by your sources, by your immediate sources. And Fang Bui, our publisher, had this great, in his essay in their show, for your show, has this great term that I've never actually seen before, and he dubbed you a born geomatic empath. Which I know it's such a wonderful but also really accurate term, I think, for your practice. So maybe we could just start there, and you can talk about your show through your initial influences to become a born geomatic empath, since you have such an interesting biography as well.
Yeah, Fang is good at coming up with situations and themes like that. My show up currently for another week has been up for the past 3 months, and it's 20 years of work kind of based on my moving to Lima from New York in 2003. And starting with a show in the same space actually where I'm doing my show now. So it's kind of a nice cyclical moment, 2003 to 2023. A lot of the works that are in the show are works that I did related to Peru specifically, and some are reproductions. But Lima's been a very fascinating. I'm not from Lima. I'm actually from Cusco, born to North American parents who moved to Ollantaytambo, a small town in the Andes, in 1974, 75. My mother's a painter and my father a writer. So it's kind of born into a situation that was, in a way, it's a little bit more international with a very kind of rural setting. A small town, Inca town, without electricity or running water at that point, and where my brother and I went to local elementary school. I mentioned this because I think it definitely informs a lot of the work I've done this far. And then, well, in 2003, moving to Lima, a lot of the materials, as you say, Tom, a lot of these kind of materials that were part of the city kind of made themselves very present in my work. I switched from doing work based on kind of wood in upstate New York to recycled materials, primarily because Lima's in the middle of a desert. So actually having access to wood was impossible. So I started really kind of creating a dialogue with my surroundings. Lima's a city of over 10 million people, almost 13 now. That's almost like a blanket over the sand dunes now. And one of the first things that happened to me was I'd wander around the center of Lima, was very attracted or interested in a lot of the immigration from the mountains to the coast from the 1960s onwards, which delved into a lot of politics of Lima itself, the history of Shining Path here, Fujimori, etc. And so a lot of work became, I think, just by the nature of me being in Lima, social or political. And so for me, like having this is the exhibition right now. It was nice to be able to see these works together. It was, I think, thanks to Miguel Lopez, the curator, he really did a great job putting aspects in a non-chronological order, aspects of my work together in one space.
I think that, what you mentioned about not having wood is so interesting, because it also informs kind of like this idea of fabrication with just what's around you, but that the fabrication reflects, the available materials. Just, it can be seen as kind of a quaint thing because of the, kind of internet culture we have now, but there are these pragmatic decisions you have to make as an artist, right?
Exactly. But it's pragmatic, but also looking at materials in terms of their symbolism and what they mean to a space, right? Like the image that we're seeing right now is basically using tires as a spool to then weave together a hammock. For me, that was a piece I did in Bolivia while at Cusco residency, and it was basically just finding a stack of tires. It wasn't a preconceived notion. It was a stack of tires that then ended up in my studio for a while there until I went to the market to have a juice, and the woman that was making orange juice was basically peeling the oranges like a spool, and it kind of came together. And I thought about Capro, and I thought about Oiticica's work with Cosmococa, and that all kind of made sense. But the material has to have some kind of meaning, I suppose, for me to work with it.
It's interesting that I came upon the Byron quote in reference to a Wallace Stevens poem called Theory. And the quote from Wallace Stevens is, "I am what is around me. These are merely instances." That's a quote from this poem Theory. So the idea that you were in the market and you saw, this woman peeling oranges, and then you said, well, I'll peel tires. It's just so immediate. Theory. It's interesting. He called that poem Theory, but it's kind of like it's an ironic.
Well, sometimes they're immediate.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, like the last image we saw, which was the called Mercado, is also similar. It's seeing these market crates stacked, and then being at the disco that night and kind of putting two and two together, that made sense for Santa Cruz, Bolivia. This piece is one that we were never able to take out of Bolivia because it's sewn coca leaves. So it's thinking a lot about the military involvement, North American politics, Latin American politics, everything involved in this kind of military camouflage that made with coca leaves.
Fantastic. Yeah, didn't you do a piece that was like on some weird contested triangle, like between Chile and Peru?
We did that. Yeah, we've done several. There's a project called Hawapi that my friends Maxime Holland and Susie Killinan run, and one of the spaces they decided to make artworks was this triangle between Peru and Chile that's in dispute. It's no bigger than a football field, but both have towers and military guard. So I did a kind of a utopian project about school for triangular thought. There.
It's so interesting.
Social involvement I've liked a lot, especially with the Hawapi segment, because it really is taking artists to fragile ecosystems, both political, social, or environmental, and having artists work on that. It started with Peruvian artists, but it's actually become a lot more international. The project we did on the triangle was with 10 Chilean artists and 10 Peruvian artists, a Bolivian artist, and an Israeli artist.
It kind of made me think of Gordon Maddock Clark, buying those little pieces of
I love that work.
That real estate, like the little slivers of real estate, and then selling them, in New York, some were like only a few inches on the sidewalk, but it spoke to the whole, the whole pretense of borders, the whole pretense of property, and so some of those properties come through in your work, but they come through subtly. I mean, it's interesting how you create this subtle balance between content and fabrication. Like here, this is like a landscape piece made out of books.
Phone books. So it's the first carving I did. It's all the like phone books from Lima, and it's a drawing table. It's actually I kept on drawing the drawings behind it. I drew on that table. It was I left Lima in 2007, 2008, frustrated with it, and that was my last. So if you see the three tables, that was kind of my studio setup back then. But they all kind of reference the chaos of this city.
And something you referenced, I think, in a statement on your website that when I was doing the research is you're interested in the difference between information and knowledge, or parsing what that is. So with this map, or this kind of topographic map, it's an interesting manifestation of a location, again, locale, but then it's made up of this ostensibly, informational, old school informational index.
But when it was made, it wasn't old school. So this was made in 2007, right? So 2007, we were still referencing phone books.
Right.
When I've guided students through the show, nobody knows what they are, right? So I have to explain how we used to do research in these books to find information and knowledge that now is easily available on the phone. But I think what this work is doing, it is a bunch of information that's put together into a piece, but it's also very intimate, right? Create an intimate space within this larger dynamic. And I think I've always tried to do that in a lot of the works. The works speak to kind of human scale. They want to speak of larger issues, but within individual personalized identity.
Would you say that the knowledge aspect is more intimate than the informational aspect?
I would say so. Yeah, that makes sense. The informational is just substance, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of like the very shallow, geolocation that we're dealing with in contemporary culture. So, kind of reinforcing the knowledge aspect of these in terms of locale and fabrication. So I also wanted to talk to you because in our previous conversation, you talked about how you made the transition from painting to sculpture, specifically with Elizabeth Murray at Bard. You started to get into like her.
That was one of the most beautiful moments, actually, I think, of my life. It was sophomore year. I'd gone to Bard already painting. I'd done shows in high school painting, and I'd gone into Elizabeth Murray's class, and she was amazing because she realized that I wasn't interested in actually the painting of the surface at all. Like I'd become interested in the carpentry of the stretcher bars, and I mean, as a younger student, I was also interested in her stretcher bars and the way that she would make the thing. So she allowed me to kind of delve into sculpture. So I spent the whole semester, instead of painting, making stretcher bars and stretching them with canvas, but not actually painting on them. And then doing some like forging, hand forging that went into it. So it was kind of she was such an amazing teacher, Elizabeth. I didn't get her for the first month because her whole conversation was about poetry and syntax, right? And about language and punctuation. And that first class was Elizabeth with Bob Holman teaching the class. And it was kind of like it was beautiful because in the moment that you understand the commas in her work are the moments that you kind of create that invisible bridge between sections. And I think that's something I've always tried to do in my work after that.
Yeah, I think I think, Eleanor, we have an image of one of Elizabeth Murray's armatures. Yeah, there we go.
Someone just wrote, her commas are the anchors, exactly. And I would say the same, her commas are the anchors to the work, you know.
So here's a great picture of, this is from Art Forum in 1998. You had her in 2000?
98.
Oh, so this is contemporary with.
Yeah, exactly. It was right around that time.
So this is interesting because, you know, normally we don't necessarily see those structures. We see the paintings, and here you can almost see like how she's organizing her dynamic symmetry and how those transitions are worked out like physically. And it seems like such a big part of your work, how these transitions are worked out physically, but it is also ideological in your work in terms of, you know, the transition between information and knowledge, the kind of.
I think also, sorry, Tom.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
I got overly eager.
No, it's fine.
I think it's also the idea of being able to portray or show everything that's real in the background, that's covered up, and it's something that I've tried to stay kind of a little bit true to, which is not really hiding things. And right. I liked all the stuff that was happening behind Elizabeth's paintings that informed the way that the space worked, right? The way that her drawings worked. And it was like always something, I'd go up to one of her paintings and want to look at what was happening behind. So
no, that's wonderful, that sense of transparency, which, you know, has ideological meaning as well. I mean, it's you know, it's kind of like this, it is what it is, this is what it is, you know. I'm taking these materials and presenting them to you in these different kind of formats. And so another, just to speak of influences, another influence, early influence, was Martin Puryear, and I think we have an image of his. So this is just to put a bit of a fine point on your transition from painting to like fabrication, and also like working with hand tools, the emphasis on working with, you know, hand tools and working with your hands and that immediacy.
I think I had at Bard, I had a lot of a good relationship with the work of Martin and also with Mel Edwards. I think partly because I related their work a lot to my hometown, Ollantaytambo. A lot of Martin's work with quipus was interesting to me because it was based on Peruvian history, Incan knowledge and language. And his handworking related directly to my youth, where, as I've mentioned before, I lived in a town without electricity. So all the tools were manual. I was fortunate enough to have been around the town with the blacksmiths who would make the nails for the houses. You know, you didn't go and buy a nail, you made a nail. So those kind of things I found very interesting in Martin's work, because they related a lot to I think my own youth. And I saw them as very poignant in that way. And Mel Edwards as well, like all his smaller scale kind of intimate approaches to very heavy subjects were impressive.
Yeah, I've heard him speak, and he talked about the process of apprenticeship too. Like he apprenticed with some woodworkers early on in his career, and it made a huge impact. Their care and the time that they took. So that process also has a meaning that isn't necessarily immediately obvious.
Yeah, that process and that knowledge, which is not information, so to speak, it's
Yes.
that knowledge that you gain in something. There's a kind of big difference between information and knowledge. You can see it directly in Martin's work.
Yeah, no, that's a great connection there. So let's get back to the show.
Okay.
I just wanted to touch on those because those were influences that you mentioned. So.
In fact, I don't know, my book just came out, so I've been looking through it, but I'll find some early images from works way back then are definitely a lot more inspired by Martin. So if you look it up on the website, you'll see all the work from like these type of works. I don't know if anyone can see that, but.
Yes. I've seen those. Yeah, those are amazing. The kind of the grid matrix that you set up. Very different in a way than Martin's work, though. Very, very, very different in your own way.
I ended up visiting Martin a couple of times. I was working upstate New York after college, and I was working for Jillian Jagger, great sculptor, and Martin's house was nearby. I wanted to work with him, but I ended up working with him. But I visited him several times, and it was, for me, some of those kind of meaningful moments in life is when you visit someone that you've been admiring for a long time. So it was spectacular.
These works are really interesting. So you have kind of like a punching bag made out of those hollow bricks, which again are redolent of, like a rural, I mean, here it would be cinder block, but these are kind of more handmade, right? They're ceramic.
We made that work. That was for part of a show that I did at Ronnie's Gallery in Mexico City, where I've been working directly with a lot of my interest in art, in Mexican architects. So this piece is called Gimnasio Barragán, after Barragán, the architect, and etched on the mirror in the background are all his kind of utopian plans for Mexico City. So once again, kind of thinking about, there's a word in Spanish which is culturismo, which is sounds like culture, but culturismo is to bodybuild. So it's playing with the whole kind of wording of bodybuilding mixed with culture and mixed with architecture, and obviously referencing Smithson's corner mirrors as well in the works. I wanted a space that I think there's a little bit of humor in this piece too, versus others, but I wanted a space that kind of referenced contemporary architecture and vernacular architecture mixed with urban thinking and real planning.
I also see reference, like, I mean, just for personally, I see reference to surrealism and say like the large glass or early surrealism that had to do with like machinic kind of anthropomorphized machinic interventions, like Picabia. Now, what is that wall in the background? What is that made out of?
So the wall is actually a work from a different show. It wasn't part of that initial show. It was a show from a project I did at the MACRO, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Rome. And I carved out that wall in relationship to a whole other body of work that had to do with Mussolini's great utopian, or not great, whatever you want to consider it, but his utopian designs for the euro. And so I was looking at those elements and thinking about how you make something that is so hard feel soft.
You did something similar in the Celiosas Mexicanas in 2016, the group show at Gallery Weekend. So you use pulverized brick symbolizing a surviving culture.
Yeah. Well, the pulverized brick thing I've done in several different moments, specifically starting with the kind of reference to Smithson's Latin American triangle. And so I kind of replicated, the first one I replicated was a triangle, but it was made from about 20 different demolition sites throughout Mexico City, and then recompressing that brick dust. In Latin America, kind of a shamanistic practice is to surround your house with red brick dust, and that protects your house. So I was thinking a lot about how demolition then could become life, or become something that's protective instead of something that's just sad or nostalgic.
I love this quote of yours. It's like one that rises and rebuilds with fractions of its own history. It's also reminds me of the poem, portion of that around me. And, so there's, when you go to Mexico City, you see some of these temples reproduce, like reconstructed out of that Tezontle stone, which is kind of like this volcanic, very intense kind of volcanic stone.
And I love that stone. I use that in the Celosias Mexicanas. I use those alongside the books. Did you see that, Tom?
Yes. But what's interesting about that is, when you, and this references Smithson and perhaps even like Borges, in terms of his influence on Smithson, in terms of the ruins. I'm thinking of his story, The Immortal, where he encounters this, the protagonist in that story encounters this ruin, but it's a maze. So, when you go to Templo Mejor, you see parts of in Mexico City, you see parts of it that are extant and parts that are reconstructed. So it's interesting because you're not quite sure like what parts are reconstructed and what parts are, you have some idea,
and how real that reconstruction is. There's a lot of reconstructed pyramids here in Lima that are completely fake. It's just someone imagined them that way and they got built that way, right? So it's, it's kind of
I guess
modern,
and that also, where you were, the town where you were born is an archaeological site as well, isn't it?
It is. Ollantaytambo, the interesting thing about Ollantaytambo is that it was a temple in construction when the war broke out, some 600 years ago. So all the stones were just kind of left in the place that they were. You see them in a kind of a trail from the quarry all the way down, crossing the river and going up this big ramp, huge monolithic pink granite. I had the privilege of actually doing homeschooling after doing my elementary school, public school in Ollantaytambo with Jean-Pierre Pratson and Robert Batson, and doing a whole Earth Watch moment. And that, I think it was one of the most informative moments of my life, was to work with them, because we were able to measure out the ruins and do earth samplings and dig through layers of information. And I think that really informed a lot of my work. My town is between Cusco and Machu Picchu, so it's halfway in the Sacred Valley and surrounded by archaeology mixed with a kind of modern vernacular architecture.
Right. You incorporate you do incorporate a modernist armature, if I may, into your work, but then they're kind of populated by these local fragments.
Mm-hmm. Latin American modernism specifically, because of those moments of kind of utopian thought in the 1960s and 70s, and even before that, when Le Corbusier did his first talks in Buenos Aires and Sao Paulo, and influenced the whole kind of generation of architects. And so I was thinking about how that singular moment has transformed the history of a place, and trying to kind of figure out what the next singular moment will be.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. When I was reading your biography as well, is talking about when you moved back to Seattle, and this kind of, it sounds like a crazy situation, this place called Maryhill, which is kind of like combined all these very crazy ideas. I shouldn't say crazy, but like kind of like visionary ideas of utopia. It include like a replica of like Stonehenge, and you mentioned that might be an influence.
Well, it definitely was when I did my senior project there. So I stayed there for almost a month. And Maryhill is this museum that was built by Sam Hill. And Sam Hill basically named after his daughter, but he did do a replica of Stonehenge. But inside the museum is actually, I think it's the largest collection of Rodin sculptures outside of Europe. It's in the US, and it's in the middle of Eastern Washington in this kind of opulent mansion in the middle of nowhere. And so there's, it was an interesting situation to look at, because you had that, and then you had this Quaker town that he had developed, which was basically almost like a Disneyland fantasy of a place that never really functioned, but yet he had this vision, right? And he had the economics to be able to like technically make it work.
Yeah, it's those crazy instances of intentional communities that happen, all over the world. But like, when you think about them in the United States, they become these strange kind of eclectic islands that, they gather their own kind of Wunderkammer, like cabinet of curiosities in this very subjective vision of like the individual who had, the wherewithal to do that. So it's an interesting, parallel to thinking about how the artist does that as well,
The artist does that, or kind of just this world of like possibilities, right? Of
Right.
things, if you weren't limited by the resources that you have, what could this possibly be? And that's kind of an interesting thing, especially when you think of a place like my own hometown, like the Incan Empire, the way that the arrangement of the Aini or the Ayu are formed, which is about kind of communal work. So I was moved by those type of moments.
No, I mean your work I found really remarkable with regards to how it synthesizes all this stuff, but it still retains its coherency in that synthesis. Which could, potentially just be fragmented, but there's an interesting, I think it has to do with your relationship to fabrication. So there's a place where fabrication and theory they're just like perfectly balanced in your work.
Or the design aspects, I'm often criticized for how, I guess, a certain kind of elegance in the work versus the themes that are present in them. But I've always liked craft, I suppose. I've always liked the way that the hand or the mind knowledge function towards kind of defining a space and care in that space. And like the image that we're seeing right now, that includes my school books from the 1980s in the back of the piece. That's very kind of modern on the front part, but that really relate a lot to the retablos, these religious spaces, but that in Peru have been used to describe very political situations. So I wanted to kind of make note of that. And I think there are a lot of kind of layers that happen inside the work that I like. And I like when the work feels like it's very light initially, and then you can go almost like an onion, you can go peeling the layers and discovering what's kind of really behind, and knowing that there's more to it than just the initial reading.
This is perfect timing, Eleanor, for this particular piece in our conversation. Can you unfold it again? I think if you just go back a couple of, yeah, I love this sequence too, because it shows that kind of unfolding, that you just kind of eloquently mentioned, Ishmael. And this question of grace and this question of, yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think, maybe the contemporary mind sometimes is embarrassed by grace, or it's embarrassed by, kind of an, I wouldn't say elegance, but like a simplicity of, and that goes to the idea of transparency too. There's a transparency and a simplicity to those frameworks that you're creating for these fragments that, I can see critics saying, well, they're too elegant or this or that, but
Yeah, well,
I
they're
don't know
also,
what you're looking for,
also,
you know.
when I draw them out, they seem kind of silly. You know, I often think of like the Hudsucker proxy, you know, it's like the the invention of the hula hoop or something like that. You draw it on a paper and it doesn't do the same as when it's finally done. And you understand that like sometimes that simplicity of form, which is iconic, can really work. And often too, it's working with materials that I'm not very keen on, like brass. I don't really like brass, but I've been working on it because I think it's important in these works to use brass. Brass is a very kind of material that's, for me, kind of like ugly in a way, and it portrays different things, except for one moment that I found recently that I really like a lot, which is with Fausto Melotti's work. And so it's interesting because it contrasts the concrete so much that it works. And then
Right. It's kind of a crass, I mean, I think it's kind of a crass material too, you know.
Yeah.
So, you know, the idea that you're using it and you hate it is fascinating. You know? It's like, you know, you're looking past the kind of subjective, you know, abhorrence of this material, because, you know, it has like kind of kitschy references to, you know.
Exactly, but for like this work, it needed to be brass. I actually tried making it in wood. I tried making it in other materials, and they just didn't work. They didn't have that same connotation that led you to a spirituality, or like a space that referenced a kind of atemporal space that was important.
So maybe we can, yeah. So here's some more kind of topographic works. Do you want to talk about this particular installation?
Oh, this is, I don't know if there's an image that shows a back, but there's carved books. At one point in my life, I did a lot of book carvings and kind of became known for that until I didn't want to be known for that anymore. And meaning I became known to that to a point where every show that I was doing, or every curator selecting me for a project, only wanted something related to book carvings. So I'd kind of stopped doing it because of that. And that I don't think it's the background of that, but from 2000, I think 6 or 7 to about 2014, 15, I was dealing with very specific books and carving them. In the case of the beam that was there, it's called the piece is called I-beam. If you go back one, I-beam, and it's all books on revolution. So that,
and then we also see in this installation, like one of your kind of structures in the background there with the kind of looks like scaffolding, which reminded me of Brancusi's, you know, museum at 3 a.m.
Exactly. It's called Endless Column, the one in the back, not the museum.
Oh, really?
Not the. Yeah,
no, I'm sorry, not Brancusi.
Brancusi.
Giacometti. I was thinking the Giacometti.
Yeah, I've always loved that work. I remember going to MoMA several times, like visiting that piece is for me one of the, like, I love it. The intimacy of it, the fact that it's a model, but it's also a real space.
Yeah,
the kind of insanity of it too is beautiful.
It's endlessly fascinating.
Yeah. Well, so you have Giacometti on one side, and on the other you have like Endless Column, which is made out of reproductions of archaeological items, and they're all different clays. From different regions of Peru, and put together in a very kind of fragile, you touch it and it all kind of collapse type of moment.
Did you cast those from like tourist items?
Yeah, so we got reproductions, like fakes that look very real, and made replicas of them.
Yeah, those are the things that, you know, if you go to like, you know, Teotihuacan, they have, you know, vendors selling those things in Mexico City. And but exactly. There's also in this installation too, there's an interesting kind of reference to museology and the presentation of that. If we can go back one, Eleanor, on the left there, the presentation of these artifacts. What is that?
That's the title of the show, actually, which is Metalizamos Nuestras Memorias. We metalize our memories is the title of the exhibition. And metalize our memories comes from a store that I found in the center of Lima that said, we metalize your memories. And I kind of went, okay, what's my memory versus our memory? What that store does is usually it takes kids' shoes, like babies' shoes, and electroplaques them in copper to then kind of crystallize that shoe forever, right? You make it into something other than the little fake leather shoe it was. And so what I ended up doing for a while was go to all the archaeological sites. Lima is filled with pyramids, many different cultures of pyramids in the middle of the city. So you can walk basically from my studio to these pyramids. They're all made of adobe, and a lot of them are kind of abandoned. And I end up collecting garbage from these pyramids and metallizing that garbage. So it's kind of a way of thinking. I think I'm thinking about Frederick Jameson, Archaeology is the Future, as a reference, thinking about energy and even from arte povera standpoint of copper and how you electrocute something and it turns into something else.
What I find refreshing about this work, Ishmael, is that, you obviously know all those theoretical references, but it doesn't feel like that.
Yeah.
It feels more like knowledge than information.
Okay. Yeah. It is. Yeah. I think it's a nice thing to have all that in one piece, though, right? So I was talking about with the layers and like I would never want the work to feel like it's all that information from the onset. I need it to just kind of feel like it's part of the person looking at it.
Well, the anecdote of the store that, does the bronze baby shoes, it's similar to the anecdote of the woman peeling the orange. It's like getting these immediate references from the everyday that often will lead one to, the poetics of the piece.
And the poet, like the reference also the poetics of space, right? You probably don't see it here, but in the lower right-hand corner, there's a small screen that shows the archaeological site, like a little tiny light box that shows the archaeological site where it all came from. So in reality, that becomes really small. Oh, we lost the screen there for a second. Eleanor, I don't know what happened there, but we've gone back to. Are we still there? Am I frozen?
Yeah, I think it's okay. Oh, there's a screen. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I lost the slideshow.
Well, there's a video in the background of this particular slide. It shows like a front loader moving brick. Is that a video installation?
So that's a video installation I did about when I returned to Lima after being in New York in 2010 to do a show. I wanted to work on kind of actions for Lima, one of which was a work that was moving this house through the desert until it kind of became destroyed. We filmed in 60 millimeter. I worked with Jorge Viñati, who was Werner Herzog's film cameraman for Fiscaraldo. And so I wanted to kind of reference different parts of problematics and kind of proving history. So you have this like moment where you're taking this kind of whole house. I reference him and I also reference Colleen Smith, who had done this beautiful video, a great friend of mine, and she did this great video of like this house being kind of moved into this hole.
Mm-hmm.
What I liked about that video was that it was very poignant here in Peru, specifically because it's a lot about people, right? Migrants, and about space and what spaces belong to whom.
I'm wondering, Ishmael, like I know, like in Newfoundland, Canada, there was a government program to move people from the interior to the from the coast to the interior. I was wondering if there was something similar in Peru to move people from the mountains to like the desert.
The economy, I mean, economics is the main motivation. All the main business is all on the coast. So unless you want to kind of keep farming or work in a mine, your chances of a better life for your family are on the coast.
But it wasn't like a government. Was it
no,
a government?
And then under Peruvian law, if you kind of invade a space, it's almost like a land claim, land grab. If you kind of build this house, which is exactly the same format as what you see in this video, the dimensions, and you stay on that land for 10 years, and you pay your taxes, your municipal taxes, eventually the government should give you that land.
So it's like squatters.
There's a few other kind of political issues happening in the work. And then also Gordon, we were talking about Gordon Monte Clark early. His great video "Fresh Kill," which is basically a bulldozer moving his van until it destroys, is also referenced in this piece.
Also, the Smithson partially buried woodshed.
Exactly.
So what is this one? You're crushing a delivery.
Tricycles. Tricycle is one of the first forms of kind of business, which is ambulatory business in Peru, where you can't really afford a store or a space, one of the first things you buy is a tricycle so you can move your business from place to place. At the time that I did this, I was thinking a lot about abuses of power. There were whole areas of Lima that the government was trying to move out kind of overnight and kind of bulldozing. And so I was thinking about the fragility and strength of humanity, I guess, against the machine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an aspect of the political aspect of your work that I was looking for, in asking you about government policies of relocation. And you did mention that an early influence was Christoph Wojcicki.
Yes, I liked his homeless shelters early on. A lot of his work I kind of speaks to me, but his homeless shelters were very important. I think I first saw one of them at Exit Art, and it was the Papacola run.
Yeah. No, I remember Exit Art very well. Can we look at that slide, Eleanor? It's at the end. It's like the shopping cart. It's a great image because no, it's not. It's
all the way down.
I think it's at the very end.
The last slide.
Oh no, second to last. Second. So this is a great image because it's in front of Trump Tower, for one. It's an image from, I think, 1989 approximately. This is one of his homeless, adaptable kind of homeless shelters. This thing kind of pops out and becomes like a whole environment. And that kind of itinerant architecture is interesting, and I included this slide in the show because you did mention him as an influence.
Yeah, so when I did the cart piece that you saw earlier on, which is called Nomade, I was thinking a lot about from 2007. I was thinking a lot about him, Margetica Protek's work, revolving around also favelas and kind of new space in Venezuela, and then some design aspects of Andres Attel's too, from those pieces.
Yeah, great segue, Eleanor.
So that's if you look at that, that's all made from oil cans, right? It's just it's cooking oil cans, and it's the back side of them, kind of putting them together as kind of design thing. It had electricity. It's basically a home, and I designed it initially with some collaborators of mine that had come through the studio that didn't have a house, so I made it for kind of a place for living. I think in 2007, I was really looking at ways of expanding sculpture into the city here and making them more kind of, I guess the word would be kind of productive or useful within a poetic sense. That's kind of an interesting thing, right? What's useful in art, but yeah, that's.
What was the public reception?
The thing is that I didn't make it initially for the public. I made it for the family. So the family used it as a place where they cook for other people. And then eventually the Cuenca Biennial wanted to show it. And it got good praise for kind of, I guess, for what you would say, like, I think because of the craftsmanship in it was kind of the interest is converting something that in 2007 is kind of like useless, relegated to something that is useful.
Yeah, it's elegantly provisional.
Yeah.
What is this piece in front of it in this slide? Looks kind of like a paper airplane.
So it's a set of 3 tables. I think there's a better slide of that, Eleanor, if you can see it. It's called Necesito alas para volar, lápices y piedras para pensar, y flores para nuestra muerte, which I guess I can translate into English. We need I need wings to fly, stones and pencils to think, and flowers for our death. And it was actually an announcement in the Comercio, the local paper here, in the kind of wanted section. And it stayed in my mind for a really long time and I'm always ashamed I never called that number, and it kind of like left me. I wrote it down because it seemed like such an interesting thing to ask for. And I'd found this store that rented decorations for coffins, for funerary coffins, right? So, and part of them were these elements that look to me like paper airplanes. And so I rented them, and then eventually bought them and started kind of transforming them into drafting tables and drawing tables, and it made sense to me as a way to memorialize the whole 1980s, 90s context here in Peru.
Mm-hmm. So these look like cast concrete, but they're not?
They are concrete.
Did you cast them, or did they come like that?
No. So I reproduced from the smaller pieces. They're about this size.
Okay.
Decorations, and blew them up and then cast them in concrete, and then made these pieces that reference both like floral wreaths, paper airplanes, weapons, and desks, and wanted all that to kind of be combined into one element that was about memory, is about memory.
Also, I find it interesting that there's kind of like this element of hyperbolic modernism. You mentioned, like Brasilia, building this hyperbolic modernist city in the middle of the Amazon. There is an aspect of that in your work. It's a little cheeky, I don't know if you would agree with that.
No, I think there is. I think thinking about Costa and Niemeyer's plans for Brasilia, and the fact that they basically drew out one big bird and then built a city based on one big bird in cement. There is something cheeky just about that too, which is you're taking over redefining a whole nation based on that. But if you actually look through history, it's kind of there's that aspect. The Incas built all their cities into animal forms. Mm-hmm. Like two llamas, a puma, and it's like, that's kind of the design of it. And even if you think of the Nazca lines, there's something about that too. So I think it's just like layers of information, some of which are very simple.
But I was thinking thinking of that, but I was also thinking about like with the tripod with these pieces, like an Eames chair, or
the design aspects too, yeah.
Like that. I mean, that interests me as maybe like an attenuated relationship to modernism. Which I think, someone like Katie Nolan did pretty well. You could take a look at that. So, here's Katie Nolan using her kind of provisional structures. But, it's interesting, in relation to what you're talking about, fabrication and like brass versus concrete versus steel. A lot of her work's made out of aluminum, and, critics have made the point that the aluminum is kind of like the perfect postmodern material because it's kind of quasi-reflective, and it's really light and kind of insubstantial. So I do see that same relationship in your work to materiality.
I've been criticized for being too modern sometimes in my materials, but I think as we're getting into this, I've recently been looking at this term kind of meta modern, right, which is where we are now instead of postmodern, and thinking about the fact that you can mix all these elements together is kind of interesting, because it's not just like the criticism. We think of modernism and materials, it's like, okay, the meaning of material or whatever, and the kind of, you have to imbue that kind of knowledge into that. And then postmodern is kind of the anti of that. And then this meta modern is just like, just let's mix all together and create some kind of poetry and sense of it. So I like that.
I think I like that term too. I mean, recently someone reviewed my work, said it was meta minimalism,
Yeah.
But I think there's an interesting subject in that too, like a content in a meta middle, not just like the way it looks, but also what it means.
Yeah. Well, allowing for that kind of meaning to come back through in the materials as well, I
Yes.
think.
Yeah, no, fascinating. And can you talk about this particular piece?
So this work is the only one in the show that was in the original show in that same space. I started it in 2003. You've seen several of the carts in kind of my work, so you've seen that it kind of reiterates several times. But this one, I came back from New York and went to Cusco and started carving and forging corrugated steel into these rocks. Based on thinking about a lot of these, it's called a piece called Balances Tensiones, Balances and Tensions, and thinking a lot about street culture and migration and the weight of history. So I think it's a very kind of powerful piece, is because it's also its potential for mobility is interesting. Its historical connotation is interesting. Initially, I worked on it as a kind of a performative piece. I wanted to kind of go through the center of Lima, trying to kind of sell these rocks with these. So the rock being from the Sacred Valley, being the same kind of stone that the Incas used in Pisac and Ollantaytambo to build the sacred temples, and kind of trying to go to the city and try to kind of almost sell history, you know?
Yeah, there's also, I mean, when I look at this, I see, references to like agrarian, equipment, but also like the small scales that people use sometimes in the market to like measure things, and makes me think, back to like the Incan system of numeric measurement. So I mean, there's many different vectors working in this particular piece. What's happening on the wall back there? What's that?
So the wall back there is a piece called Trofeos para Vallejo, Trophies for Vallejo. There's a poem that he wrote called Heraldos Negros, Black Heralds, I guess it's called in English. And it's a poem that we had to memorize when we were kids in elementary school. And every time we would forget, you're talking about rural Peru in the 1980s, right? Every time we'd forget a part of the poem, we'd get slapped by the ruler on our hands. And the start of the poem is, "Hay golpes en la vida tan fuertes, yo no sé." There are golpes, there are hits in life so hard, or yeah, I don't know, etc. So I thought it was very ironic to have to memorize this poem, and then get hit every time you didn't remember a part of it. And so what I'd done in this circumstance is I'd gone kind of at night and stole car letter tires. And you can't really see it from here, but let's see if I can find it in the book. So if you see it here, I don't know if I'll just put up the screen, but you'll see that. So there are like from every kind of brand of tire, I took a letter and tried to recreate the poem from kind of wealthier suburbs in Lima.
That's great.
So it was kind of like and Vallejo for me is one of kind of seminal Peruvian poets, an amazing writer, and someone that's been very important in the work. I think it's also it's a piece that a lot of people here connect to, which has been great to see in the show, because I hadn't shown it here. I actually presented the first time in the Museo del Barrio in New York for the triennial. I never shown it in Peru. So it was nice to kind of put it up and have people actually that actually have that history to this with this poem be in front of it.
It's interesting. It reminds me of something like Marcel Bruter's the poetry.
Exactly, and the kind of like the erasure, but also the fact that like memory fails you. So like the whole challenge here was like not looking at the poem and trying to remember from my mind aspects of the poem and just put those words in where I thought they should go.
right? And just grabbing them off of, like, razoring them off of tires is amazing.
Yeah, without damaging the tires. I always thought it funny for the person who like came to their car and found one letter missing off their tire.
Yeah, it must have been like even like scarier than just getting your tire, like like
It's pretty freaky. My
Like, what is
eight gone.
it's very funny. So I don't know how are we doing on time, Eleanor?
I think it would be a good time to move to the Q&A. We have some
Sure.
great
That went
questions.
really fast, too fast, Tom. I could continue talking for a while.
Yeah, me too. I gotta go visit you in Peru soon.
You're welcome anytime.
It'd be wonderful.
Yeah, that was an incredible conversation. Thank you so much, Ishmael and Tom. That was super fun. We've got some great questions from the audience today, and our first one will be from Chio. You should be able to unmute to ask your question, Chio.
Hi, hi Ishmael. Hi everybody.
Hi, Chio.
I'm not sure which of I had two questions, so I'm not sure which one you want me to ask, or both, or what.
You can ask both.
Okay. So Ishmael, I saw your show. I was blown away by it. It's a really, really Peruvian, but at the same time, it's kind of something you can see and understand anywhere, I think, in the world. And I recommended your show to my students. So there's a lot about the show that I really liked. But my question was, the first one was, because I'm a Peruvian artist, like you, and I wanted to know what you think about the Peruvian art world. The way I wrote it in the Q&A was, I'm interested in knowing what your view is on the Peruvian art world, if there even is one. And I said, I'm not trying to be negative. It's just, it is what it is. That was the first one. And I'll just throw in the second one and I'll see whatever you want to answer. If there's any influence from Isamu Noguchi in your work, because when I encountered your show in Lima, I kind of felt Noguchi in the air, but I might be wrong. I don't know.
Answer to, I guess, second question is yes, there is. Ejercicio para Nuevo Mundo wasn't a show, but I did a lot of work with like carefully polishing stones, and the work that I did for the spiral staircase that's outside the Ipna into the sky is kind of very like Noguchi-esque. Second, in terms of the Lima art scene, I mean, I think when I was lucky to come back here in 2003 and be part of these kind of collectives like La Culpable, Tupac, and Drama that no longer exist. And can we kind of like, I feel like at that moment built up with the help of Mali, the Lima Art Museum, built up a whole kind of a situation that was happening in Lima that I think sadly with the pandemic has kind of like dissipated, or something's happened that's difficult right now. One thing that I think is really refreshing though is it's given a lot of space for kind of younger collectives. And I feel like there's a whole new generation of artists here emerging that aren't as commercially oriented as I think the art scene here had become. That become commercially oriented versus the art scene that I kind of first encountered here, which for me was refreshing coming from New York. I think that would answer that question.
Okay.
And Peru culturally is so rich. That's
no.
amazing.
I mean, I've lived in New York like you, well, not as long as you have. I've been there for 11 years. And when I came back, it was very frustrating. It still is really frustrating. It's really hard. Most people don't understand what I do in my own work. It's like I'm a Martian or something here, but I don't want to take more space. So thanks for your answer.
Feel free to reach out to me, Chio, and I'll continue to have that conversation.
Thank you so much for those really great questions, Chio. Thanks, Ishmael, for the generous response. Our next question is from GE, and if anybody else would like to ask a question, just please raise your hand or send a message in the chat.
Thank you so very, very much, Eleanor, and hi, Tom and Ishmael. I'm just looking at the works for the screen, and I'm thinking, do other senses beyond the visual and the tactile, like the sonic, and the olfactory, figure into your making?
Probably not as much as I would like them to. It's something that I've definitely thought about. It's the same thing. I think sound has been as problematic for me as color. When I decided to stop, part of the reason I stopped painting was because I just didn't understand how to deal with color anymore. And besides the fact that my mom is an amazing painter, and it was going a little bit like competing with my mother, but sound is another whole thing that gives it a new dimension. There's like the spiral staircase makes a certain sound, and that sound becomes so present it becomes a piece. And yeah, I think I should think about it more. The olfactory is always important to me. I made this installation out of kind of these like raw latex balls, like balls in the way that they were removed from the Amazon or taken from the Amazon initially, and the whole space smelled of kind of barbecue because they burned the rubber. So that was really important and impactful. And then we talked earlier about the coca leaf piece. In that show, the coca leaves smell so strong that your whole room is impacted by that. So your whole sense of the space is impacted by that, which of course, through the screen, you can't really get that sense. But I think if the material has a smell, like a smell, then I kind of go with it, right?
Absolutely. And it seems as though the one piece that you built that would move through the city with the kind of balancing pieces almost sounds like it would make a kind of sound. It must be so kinetic in its sound.
It does, and almost kind of strangely threatening too. I mean, people are very like you start moving that, and everyone really backs away, right?
That's wonderful. Thank you.
Because they're almost like bells, like the rocks start hitting each other, and you get the sense like something's gonna break. It's very fragile, even though it's solid.
Thank you so much, GE. That was an awesome question. I see Veronica is raising their hand, so I'll give you a chance to unmute.
Hi. Speaking of sound, I was thinking about in Peru, the ambulantes, the street vendors, how they sell their wares, how they sing or chant from long distances, and it's almost nostalgic because you almost think it's going to end soon, that they go through the neighborhoods and they're selling their wares. And then I thought of your work with the bricks and the cinder blocks that are exposed, which you see in many of the homes in Lima and all over Peru, the houses that are unfinished. And I wanted to know if those daily references, those bad visual stimuli from everyday Lima is what brought you back to Lima.
What brought me back to Lima initially was love. I wasn't intending on coming back here. I built out my studio in Brooklyn. I was intending on staying in Brooklyn. But my girlfriend at the time was from here, and Fujimori had fallen, our dictator had fallen. And she was a journalist, and she wanted to come back and work here. So I kind of went, okay, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do something while I'm there. But I was very impacted by Lima, and I was very surprised by it. There are artists here that were working that I had no clue about. And so it's kind of happy to reconnect with a part of my history that I thought that I'd kind of abandoned in a way, or kind of neglected. Lika Mutal, for example, or Rodriguez Larraín, or Ailson as artists were all influential in my first years here. I always liked with the unfinished buildings here. The unfinished buildings are there for kind of a tax purpose, right? As long as you keep building, you don't have to pay taxes. But beyond that, the people here call the rebar sticking out of the tops, los fierros de la esperanza, the steel of hope, which is you're always going to build one more layer on to the building. One of the things I've always also appreciated about here is that I never see any cities that I feel like are, or any streets that I feel like are dead, because they're always in constant construction. So there's always motion and commotion happening, which is interesting because it makes it feel like it's alive all the time. Yeah, and the sounds of the street vendors. I grew up on the train platform, at the Dumbo. My parents literally took over the abandoned hotel built in 1923 that was on the train platform. So the train would come through in the morning and people would descend on it to sell their wares, right? And so those kind of things are very stuck in my memory of a market that all of a sudden comes to life in a second. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you, Veronica. And a huge thanks again to Ishmael and Tom for the wonderful, wonderful conversation. And thank you for tuning in, everybody. We have a tradition here at the Rail of ending our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm really excited to welcome Will Stanier to the stage. Will Stanier is a poet and printer from Athens, Georgia. He's the author of the chapbook Everything Happens Next. His poems have recently appeared or are forthcoming in Annulet, The Baffler, Figure One, and Mowers Monthly. He's currently studying to be a librarian. So grateful to have you here, Will, and over to you.
Hey, everybody. I just unmuted myself. I hope people can hear me. Is that true? Nice. I'm going to switch over now. Thank you to the Rail for having me, to Carolyn for inviting me. Thanks to Ishmael and Tom for the conversation. I found it really instructive. The show looks wonderful. I have a whole paper here full of notes that would take too much time to talk about here. But I'm glad to have been a part of this. I'm going to read 3 poems recently published in the Rail's June issue. If you haven't read that issue, you should. It's really extraordinary. And thank you to Anselm for getting my poems there. I'll start over. Wealth. Regular millionaires. Run-of-the-mill regular millionaires. I'll tell you, following their money becomes very boring. It's all about property in the end, and the proper places for things. Their golden tablets, old golden bracelets, their amphibious golden tennis shoes. Following their complaints becomes a chore. They detest paying taxes and do so anyway with counterfeit tokens of the future. What millionaires touch becomes a window just for them. The windows in my house aren't windows at all. Instead, they show images of millionaires' children having fun and laughing, playing expensive-looking games of stickball. My friends and I sit inside, sulking, counting our beans. Excuse me. And this next poem is a double sonnet. It's a bit longer. It's important to me. It's about a lot of things, moving across the country. It's about my fiance's art practice and knitting. It's about a lot of things. I hope you enjoy it. It's called The Concert of Europe. The Crimean War has us all interested in fashion again. Downright rapacious knitwear. I was optimistic myself, out there sleeping with the hounds. Bed bugs, miraculous spitting beetles, you name it. From the furnace of my thinking cap down to my dancing shoes. Did I say dancing shoes? I meant bowling shoes. I meant my golf cleats. Their perforating talons of no small number. When you get to the city, we'll go out for lunch. A good meal of your choosing. It was Lord Raglan and the Earl of Cardigan at the Battle of Balaclava. But before things could really get going, my dad showed up driving his 1-cylinder street cleaner. He wanted to referee and talk shop with the generals like it was a theatrical production of Red Rover, of cops and robbers, of municipally banned lawn darts. Unfortunately, that day reminds me of all the others. Fortunately, the others were delightfully morbid in a way that makes you want to bake a cake and bring it to the park, if not for all the bat-shitting crocodiles. At night, we hear the sounds of train horns, but who's ever seen signs of the tracks? Not me.
I have a theory they pipe the horns in from somewhere else to make us feel more comfortable in our predicaments, the daily fatigue of neighborly living. Cut me some slack, will ya? The band-aids over my newly installed fish gills have begun to peel away, and that no-count doctor demands my tab paid in full. What hideous conduct. What sloppy stewardship of the venomous mathematics that plague the ticker tapes of otherwise well-meaning whatchamacallits. I measured the depth of the river by trotting my horse out into the middle of it. That was the only practical method. To say shoestring budget would be an exaggeration, somewhat less than gracious plenty. Money grows on trees like caramel apples from inflatable lamp poles in novelistic Siberia. Can you imagine mailing a postcard there? You'd need about a quilt or two of stamps, and you'd have to peel each stamp with the sharp side of an eyelash. I don't know why. Those are just the rules. And this is my last poem, a lyric poem, and just a good old-fashioned love poem. It's called On Our Way. Contrails tracing typos, piercing clouds, needles and thread. On our way, horses look funny, bug-eyed, their fly masks on. There's a man with a dog tucked under his arm, stopped on his bike chatting with a car. A woman on our left-hand side, pushing a grocery cart, box of beer underneath, another dog sitting up in the basket. And so, thinking it over, in spitting distance of love, while also holding it here. Every parking lot, either empty or full, sounds of traffic, susurrus of traffic. I will talk too much. I will talk. I will write in my journal only one thing. Look, clouds blowing fast. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you so much, Will. Those were
Will.
so amazing, really beautiful. Really looking forward to looking at more of your work. And everyone definitely read Will's poems in the Rail. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Ishmael and Tom. I would also like to thank Maho from Ishmael's studio for supporting the preparation for today's event. I would also like to thank the Terra Foundation of American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for arts, culture, and politics in our free monthly publication and our public events like our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate to support all the work that's done here at the Rail, and join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Jeffrey Batchin and Toby Camps on the event of Bright Sparks, Photography, and the Talbot Archive. We conclude with a poetry reading by Joel Chase. Thanks everyone for tuning in today, and you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you head off into the rest of your day.
Thank you everyone for joining, and thank you, Eleanor, Brooklyn Rail, for inviting.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Good to see you, man.
Thanks, thank you. Thanks, thank you.
Questions, everyone?
Thanks, Ishmael. Thanks, Will.
Hi, Melissa.
Gracias, Ismael.
Gracias.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Luis. Bye, Luis.
Bye, everybody.
See